Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us this afternoon with Ask an Expert with Kim Drew and Kirsten Lane.
First of all, thanks to all of you who took time out of your day to join us today. I'm Kim Drew. I'm going to present the first few slides, and then Kirsten will take over from there and finish up for us. This first thing, normally I would not just read to you, but Kirsten and I both felt that this was really important. These few sentences came out of the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, the collaborative. And it says, parents and families engaged in the transition planning and service delivery process and who express expectations their young person will work for competitive wages are associated with positive outcomes for young adults with disabilities. You can see there's a couple different studies quoted there. It says, other than the student or youth, their parents or other family members are most critical to an individual's success during high school, through the transition planning and service delivery process, into their communities of living, working, and I said those in the wrong order, learning, working, and living. That is not the order I normally say them, so I got a little tongue-tied there. But what we really want you to take away from this is you're doing one thing right here, right now by participating in this webinar. But you can see from that quote that your involvement in the process, your engagement with the process, setting high expectations for your son or daughter, starting at a very early age, and then offering your son or daughter the opportunities to become better at self-determination throughout their lifetime, starting from a very early age. That may have to be adjusted as time goes on and they're able to do more and more of that on their own. But it's really important for kids to be able to learn to use their own voice and not always have to count on a parent or a sibling or a para or a teacher to do that speaking for them. So self-determination, let's start there. So the definition is the process by which a person controls their own life. So we all have self-determination skills. Maybe we're better in some areas than others. That's true for kids. It's true for adults. But self-determination skills include choice-making, decision-making, problem-solving, goal-setting and attainment, self-monitoring, self-advocacy, self-awareness, all of those things. And it's important from as early an age as you can start with those things with your son or daughter, that you work with them and help them to learn. They're going to make mistakes. They're going to fall down. They're going to fail. I fail. I have tried things and I have failed, but I've learned from those things, and then I can do more as I learn what might have gone better had I handled it differently. So it's super important that kids learn those things early and practice them often. Okay, so as far as transition goes, as we said in the beginning, this is our Transition 101. So this is just really the basics about what transition planning means. So some of the things that you need to know is there are legal requirements surrounding transition. So transition services are a required part of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. So it's not a choice. You don't get to choose, oh, I want to take part in that, or oh, I want to do that, or no, really not so much. It's a required part of this process. So transition services are coordinated set of activities that are designed to be a results-oriented process. They're based on individual student needs, and they include a lot of different things: instruction, related services, community experience, other adult living activities when those are appropriate. In the state of Iowa, transition planning begins at age 14, and transition planning is focused on assisting the student to reach their post-secondary goals, whether that post-secondary goal means going into a community employment situation, whether they plan to go to college, be it a 2-year or a 4-year school, whether they plan to live independently. All of those things, the transition planning process includes lots of discussions with the student, with you as family members, to figure out what those post-secondary goals are and to work towards them. And just keep in mind, as for all of us, if you can think back to the time when you were 14, chances are you didn't know what you wanted to do at age 14, and it probably changed multiple times throughout your high school career, maybe even through your college career or post-college. But it's a matter of getting some goals out there, thinking about them, planning for them, and then adjusting as things change. So keep those things in mind and know that just because today your son or daughter wants to be an astronaut and next year they want to be a teacher, it's okay. You've got plenty of time to figure out what those things look like and how to move them forward. So there's a lot of the requirements, the legal requirements, like going into more detail, can be found on the Department of Ed's website. I will tell you that the easiest way to navigate that site, no matter what you're looking for, is just to go to Iowa Department of Education. At the very top, you'll see an A to Z index. And in this case, you would go to S for secondary transition, and then you'll go down the list, click on secondary transition, and it will take you to a whole bunch of information. We're going to share that link with you at the end, but we just wanted, in case you wanted to look more deeply into the legal requirements, we wanted you to know where you might be able to find that stuff. Okay, Kirsten. All right, so here's the deal. The transition planning begins at age 14. In the state of Iowa, the legal requirement from IDEA is that transition planning begins at age 16. Iowa as a state, made the decision that we didn't think starting at age 16 was soon enough. So in the state of Iowa, transition planning begins at age 14. So if you came from a different state or move out to a different state, you might hear that transition planning doesn't start till age 16. So we wanted you to have that information. So that being said, transition planning is based on age-appropriate transition assessments. Those things should be focused on a student's interests, their preferences, their strengths, and also their needs. We can't avoid the fact that students have needs in different areas. If we don't talk about the needs, then we can't help fill the gaps that will then make them successful at a later time. So again, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Those are driven by the student's post-secondary expectations. You might hear that called their PSE, for living, learning, and working. Again, I talked about this a little bit earlier about its ongoing development and refinement of transition planning. So every year at your student's IEP from age 14 on, and it may even happen sooner than that, you may start talking about their PSEs, what's going to take for them to get to where they want to go. Those things should be updated at least annually, but just know that they can happen more often than that if that's what your son or daughter needs. And so those things could be addressed in a variety of different ways, a variety of different locations. And keep in mind here that one answer isn't right for every student. Not every student in English, 9th grade English, is going to end up in the same place when they get out of high school. That is exactly the same for your students with disabilities. Not every single student is going to end up in the same place. So the key here is individualization and having open and honest conversations every year at your son or daughter's IEP. So Kirsten, I will let you take it.
Once I unmute myself, I'm going to go a little bit more in depth on what is a quality transition assessment. So Kim ended by talking about individualization being the key. It's so critical that the entire transition planning process is individualized. And the way we really get to that individualization is through these assessments. So we look at What is the student's post-secondary expectation? What are their current skills related to that? What skills are they going to need to develop? So really taking a deep dive into matching up where they're at with where they want to be and using those assessments to drive the entire IEP process. So Kim mentioned several times that this is updated at least annually. As you most of you probably know and have been involved with IEP meetings, those are required to be updated at least annually. And it's the same with transition because it is completely integrated into the IEP process. So as we do those assessments, then we take a look at what does the student need to move themselves closer to their post-secondary expectations in living, learning, and work. And so are there goals that are needed? Are there needs that that student has to learn skills that would require specially designed instruction? And if that's the case, then there might be a goal that's associated with the IEP related to this transition, the transition needs the student has. We look at the course of study. So what are the courses and activities that this student is going to need that will help them to develop the skills, the experience, the background to meet their post-secondary expectations in living, learning, and work. And then we write those into the IEP. Linkages. Sometimes a student has a need for some ongoing support or some services that might happen outside of the school setting while they're still in school or post-high school. And so we look at what are the linkages or connections to services and resources that will help this student to, again, meet that post-secondary expectation that they have in living, learning, and work. These linkages can be anything from a connection with voc rehab, which is IVRS for most students, but if your student has a visual impairment or blindness, it's the Iowa Department for the Blind. It could be a connection with disability services on the college campus. So if your student is going on to some kind of post-secondary education and has a need for accommodations and supports on that campus, we should be connecting them with that person or that agency service office that would help them to access those accommodations in that setting. It could be connections to an adult agency that will provide supports for living or working or any other kind of need, accessing the community that they might have post-high school. And then finally, how are we going to monitor this? So, we monitor, have progress monitoring for goals, but we also need to monitor, are we taking care of the activities, the linkages, the services, the supports that we've listed in the IEP to ensure that all of those things have happened. Transition assessments are not just done by the school. Certainly the school takes a key role in this, but the family is critical, the student is critical, adult providers, agencies that are working with the student, whether it be a case manager or a VR counselor. All of these folks have information that can help to help us get a better picture of who is the student and what are their needs. Unfortunately, I have to say that sometimes we'll talk with a voc rehab counselor and find that their idea for what this student is going to be doing post-high school is different from what school's idea about that is. Because when the student's with the VR counselor, they're maybe in a different frame of mind. When the student's at school, it's hard to tell why this happens, but collaboration is so important, and sharing information, idea, results from assessments so that we do all get on the same page is critical. These assessments, a lot of times people think of assessments as being something real formal, and they don't necessarily have to be. They can be if they need to be, but we follow RIOT, which is RIOT, review existing information. Sometimes you have what you need from that existing information, and there's not a need to do a major kind of formal assessment for one of the areas of living, learning, or working. Interviewing, you can get a lot of information from interviewing the student, their family members, other folks that they're connected to. Observations are another way that you can get good information, whether it's a formal or informal observation. And then testing. Testing is always an option, but not necessarily a required option for that student, for any student. So then once we have a plan for the student for transition, and we're reviewing it each year, part of that plan is talking about graduation. So this is one option, one way that a student exits special education and graduates, exits high school. So beginning at age 14, when transition planning starts, IEP teams should begin having the conversation about, is a student working toward a diploma or is a student working toward a certificate? This decision is reviewed annually. We always recommend that we start with that diploma decision. So like every student, high expectations, Kim talked about this earlier on. High expectations are critical, not just for family members, but for the student and the educators and other partners that are involved in the transition planning process. So when we start with graduation as the outcome, we begin looking at 4-3-3. So 4-3-3 is 4 years of English language arts, 3 years of math, 3 years of science, and 3 years of social studies, plus PE. Those are the broad state minimum graduation requirements. So if a student is working toward a regular diploma, at a minimum, they would need to have 4-3-3 plus PE. It's important to note that in Iowa, because of local control that districts have, districts may have other graduation requirements that are a part of this expectation as well. So they might say in District XYZ, our graduation requirement is 4-3-3 and PE, plus you need 7 electives, and you need to have some kind of course in the arts, or some kind of course in the applied arts, which is more vocational or career technical education. So they can add other requirements in. But as a student is working toward that diploma, they need to meet that district's graduation requirements. If it becomes the decision of the IEP team that that student is not working toward a diploma, then it is an option for them to work toward a certificate of attendance or completion. Districts have, again, with that local control, the latitude to adapt the way that students meet 4-3-3. So it might be that they require, for most students, algebra, geometry, and algebra 2. But they can make an amendment to if the district chooses, if that board chooses, can make an adjustment or an adaptation that says that for students who have unique needs, it can't be something that's just for kids with IEPs, but any student with a unique need, that students' teams can adjust their requirements to as to how they meet 4-3-3. Remember, the state's minimum requirements are 4 years of English, 3 years of math, science, and social studies. It does not say prescribe specifically what standards must be met or what courses must be taken. So it is perfectly okay from the state's perspective to adapt those to meet the needs of the student. And again, looking at their post-secondary expectations. So you want to make sure if a student is going on to post-secondary education that we're providing them with the skill set and the experiences and the coursework that will prepare them for post-secondary ed. It wouldn't make sense to adjust their graduation requirements and not provide the rigor that's needed for that post-secondary expectation. So critical to keep in mind those post-secondary expectations. I think that's it. Oh, no, the one other thing I do want to remind you of is on March 21st, we will have 1 week from today, session where we really go into depth on this whole graduation change. This is relatively new in the state of Iowa. It's the this graduating class, the class of 22, is the first class that has adhered to these new requirements for graduation. So we will go into depth on that next week. I also want to talk about another option for exiting special education, which is turning 21. So the IDEA states that a student with an IEP is eligible for public education until they have earned a high school diploma, they no longer have unmet transition needs, or in Iowa, it's age 21, that they can finish the school year that in the year that they turn 21. So if you are able to continue in school, if you've not yet met your diploma, not yet turned 21, or do not have unmet transition or do not have unmet transition needs. So oftentimes what happens is a student will get their diploma and then they must leave school, right? So they're done with school. However, sometimes students will go through their 4 years of school. Maybe they've met the district's graduation requirements, but they have a lot of unmet needs, or even just a few unmet needs related to transition. And so at that point, they might enter what's called 4+ services. 4+ services are still considered to be secondary services. The student cannot have received their diploma, even though they may walk across the stage, if the district allows that, with their peers, because they've met those district requirements, but have not met that second bullet we talked about in the age 21 slide of having, they have unmet needs related to transition. And so these unmet needs can be met through 4+ services. So these secondary services can be provided in a number of different settings. They can be provided in a school setting. They can be provided in a community college setting. They can be provided in a community setting. So a lot of different options for how 4+ services can be provided. But the key is that they're working toward unmet transition needs. So again, we go back to what are those post-secondary expectations that this student has? Everything comes back to those post-secondary expectations. And is the student ready to leave high school and meet those post-secondary expectations? If not, then we look at, do they need more vocational kind of training, skill development? Do they need some work experience? Have they had the work experience that they need to help them develop a solid career goal for an 18-year-old student, whatever a solid career goal for an 18-year-old student is, but do they have a career goal for post-high school? Do they have the employability skills that they need to be able to work in that setting, or do they need continued work in that area? If they do, 4+ services could be an option. Same with post-secondary education. If a student is planning to go on to post-secondary education, but they have some skill deficits around self-determination maybe, or around study skills, or around organization and planning for classes and planning for timeline to get your assignments done or your projects developed, or whatever those things might be. 4+ services could be used to prepare them for that next environment. Again, if the student has received their diploma, they may not participate in 4+ services. And if the student has turned 21, they may not participate in 4+ services. But otherwise, it's a really important consideration for students who are involved in transition planning. And we have a more in-depth session on the 28th around this 4+ services topic. So really going deep into what they are, what they look like, who receives them, where do they receive them, all of that kind of information. And then finally, we want to share a little bit of those resources with you. We're going to walk through and give you a good picture of the resources that are out there, what they look like, the kinds of information that you can gather there. And then we'll stop about 11:45 so that we have time to answer any questions that you all have. So Kim, I think I'll just start and then maybe we can kind of go back and forth. Does that work for you?
It does.
Okay. So as Kim said, sometimes it's challenging to find everything on this, on the DE website. Fortunately, I had it linked, and so it just pops right into this secondary transition page. And you will too, because you'll have a copy of the slides and the links will be live, so you'll be able to access. So when you come in, you'll see that the things that are included on this page are listed right here. So it goes over several of the things that we just talked about. And as you scroll down, then it'll talk about the legal requirements. There's a lot of detail, and I want to show you, sorry about the scrolling here. I want to show you the detail around graduation. So if you want to do some homework before our next week's session, and so you have some targeted questions, feel free to do that. But this goes through just an overview of why the change occurred, some ideas for teams, and some ideas for families. There's a video that just talks you through the entire handout on the family one. And then there's a very long webinar into a lot of detail, and you're welcome to it if you would like to review that. Then we go on into 4+ services. And again, there's several webinars here, as well as specific guidance around 4+ services. The contract is something that's really between a community college provider and the Department of Education, but it's public information in here should you want to review it. Guiding practices. This part talks about specifically the 6 key things that are required in quality transition planning. We reviewed those in our conversation today, but this is what guides the Iowa transition model, which we're going to look at here in just a minute, as well as just quality transition planning. The age of majority information is here and in a variety of languages. It's a little bit of information about WIOA, and really within that, there's some documents that talk about how we within education work with VOCA Rehab, which includes both, as I talked about earlier, the Iowa Vocational Rehabilitation Services, which serve most students who qualify for VR services, but then also the Iowa Department for the Blind, which is that agency that provides vocational rehabilitation services to students who have visual impairments or blindness. I'm going to say this real briefly right now. It wasn't really a topic of our webinar, but I think it's something good for families to know related to vocational rehabilitation. Under WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which is about 5-6 years old now, it talked about how each state needed to come up with ways that vocational rehabilitation and education work together. And so, as we just talked about, schools are charged with providing transition services as a part of the IEP process, but VOC Rehab also is charged with providing what's called pre-employment transition services, which are transition services specifically related to employment. And so WIOA said, we've got to figure out, you guys all have to figure out how you're going to do this together. So you're not duplicating services and you're not skipping services. There's a coordinated plan. So in Iowa, there's a local school plan. And we had a webinar to just help people kind of wrap their heads around how to really use this effectively. But the local school plan talks about who in each school building or each school district, who provides self-determination training. Is it the VR counselor? Is it the schools? Is it both? Who and what components? who helps students with career exploration, who provides work-based learning experiences. So it really covers the 5 areas of pre-ETS, the pre-employment transition services, and has district teams talk about how we're going to provide those services. And so I think that's important as a family member and as an educator. I know that we have lots of different folks on this call to know that as you are planning for transition services, that pre-ETS, it could be a part of that planning. So how is that voc rehab counselor working in that school to provide pre-ETS services, and how might that impact the needs that each individual student has? There is a pre-ETS agreement that is signed. So to access voc rehab services, you need to have a pre-ETS agreement signed, which says that the counselor then can work with that student while in school on specific skills that were identified. If that pre-ETS agreement is not signed, they wouldn't have access to the services that are offered in that local school plan. So I hope I did not confuse people and provided enough information. Kim, do you have anything to add or any questions to clarify?
I would just say somebody brought it up in chat that pre-ETS services, the pre-employment transition services, are available to students who have an IEP as well as students who may have a 504 plan. So those things can, students who fit either one of those categories couldn't receive pre-ETS services through voc rehab.
Right, and even if you don't have a 504 plan, if you have a disability. So I know I've worked with students who might have some kind of a health impairment or a physical disability that doesn't require a 504 or an IEP. And if you have a disability, then you can access those services. So that's a good point.
Yep. And so any of you, Deb mentioned the April 11th webinar with voc rehab. If you have any specific questions about WIOA, about pre-ETS, anything like that, voc rehab is definitely going to be able to go into even more depth. Kirsten and I both have a pretty solid foundation related to that, but it's the work they do day in and day out. So they would be able to answer even more specific questions related to WIOA and pre-ETS.
Thanks.
Sure.
And then the additional resources, I am not going to open, well, I did say I would open the transition model. The decision guides are really looking at when you're thinking about 4+ services in the area of learning or working. And it looks at matching up the post-secondary expectation with where the student is and what they need for that post-secondary expectation to help make a decision around whether or not 4+ services is a good option for that student. So those are really helpful frameworks.
I would say if you have a student at this age range, before you attend your next IEP, I would take, if you have time, take a look at both of those resources. It might help you bring questions to your IEP team or ask for clarification, or it might help start a conversation that maybe someone hadn't thought of before. It could help foster a conversation with your son or daughter as to what the plans are. So sometimes there's lots of links in there. There are links to apprenticeship programs and Job Corps and all sorts of different things. So this is a link, but inside of that, when Kirsten and I created these, there are a gazillion links inside of here. So military, Job Corps, apprenticeship programs, and then it gives you a lot of different things to think about when your student is going through high school. And then to the right there, it talks about if your student is considering a 2 or a 4-year college or university. Those are additional things, not things in place of what's on the left-hand side, but things to consider in addition to. Kirsten talked a little bit about this. If your son or daughter wants to attend, for example, the University of Iowa, and you need to know, you need to plan for, as you're working through their transition planning, not only what do they need to graduate from high school, but what are the admissions requirements for that university. If they want to go to the University of Kansas, those entrance requirements could be different from the University of Iowa. So it's really important to have a lot of things that you're considering and thinking about, and that holds true for kids with and without disabilities. Every university, every college has the ability to set their own requirements, so it's important that that planning and forethought goes into it as you consider. It's pretty easy to have more than you need than to have less than you need when you get to be a senior. So, and this just gives some examples of possible things that kind of on the left-hand side, it kind of describes the student's skills related to their post-secondary expectation, and then different decisions that might be considered is kind of the right-hand side of that document. So take a look at those, and you know, we can definitely help through that. So,
all right. So then, sorry, I've got to back up a little bit here. We have similar guide around working and then supported decision making. So not just looking at guardianship and conservatorships, but really looking at with that self-determination, presence or idea in mind, what are the different options for supporting a student as they turn 18 and become their own legal guardian, or what options do we have to help them to maintain as much self-determination as possible. And then I want to spend just a quick minute on the Iowa transition model, because as we talked about this, learning about the student's strengths, interests, and preferences is key, and then connecting those to the post-secondary expectation that the student has. We walked through this in the session, but this spells it out really clearly and talks about what does it look like. So what are the things that we're doing to make sure that we follow all of these steps of the transition model, which is using assessment to really get at what does the student need, where's the student now, where are they going to be, and what do they need to be successful in those post-secondary environments. So as we could, and there are sessions that are hours to days long on going over all of this information and going deep. But if you get into the link on the DE website, you will be able to really start to explore this in a little more depth than what we were able to do in this session. Another thing that I want to share real quick with you is the Iowa Secondary Transition Learning Community. So this site has information, a professional learning archive, so all kinds of webinars that have occurred. This is a Transition 101 series, and then there are webinars on Job Corps and assistive technology, 4+ services, that kind of information. There also is a section here on post-secondary summary resources. So a part of the transition planning process is at the very end of the process, as a student is getting ready to leave school, we're required to provide a summary of resource, a post-secondary summary that really talks through what are the students' skills in their related to their post-secondary expectations for living, learning, and working. What are their skills and how did they respond to instruction and accommodations, and what worked best for them, and what recommendations do we have for the future around living, learning, and working and their post-secondary expectation. There also is a place where you can connect with the students' needs for linkages or services on an ongoing basis. And related to that, there is this page that provides all kinds of information around all kinds of topics that a student would be most likely to want to access related to their post-secondary expectations. So there's one specifically on adult service providers and how to choose a provider and how that connects with maybe your case management services. That decision-making services and supports that we just talked about is in here. Some think abouts around assistive technology. The one I'm going to go into, but there's all kinds. Voc Rehab, which addresses IDB and IVRS, Social Security, post-secondary education and training, long-term services and supports. So this, if the student we're anticipating that student might need long-term services and supports, which might be home and community-based services or habilitation services. This document is just chock full of information, an overview of what that is, how to involve the students. So we're making sure that we're really including self-determination skills and self-advocacy in the planning process. And then it gets into what is HCBS, what are HAB services, a comparison of the different waivers, the MHDS regions. So each, there's 9, I think it is, different regions that across the state that provide services sometimes when HCBS or HAB services don't kick in, or they provide some oversight and coordination. So just a ton of information. At the very bottom of each one of these documents is additional resources and information. So there are linkages and videos on how to apply. So just a ton of information. I'm not going to show you all of these documents, but they're all laid out the same way with an overview, some think abouts, and then details followed by additional resources, a wealth of information for all of us. I wish when I was working with students, I had all of that information in one place. Oops.
And I would say that Kirsten provided all of these great resources. And as she said, there are linkages here for all sorts of things. Keep in mind that when you go to your son or daughter's IEP meeting, the school may or may not have a really deep understanding of all of those different things. For example, the HCBS waivers or things like that. But the link that she showed you there will help you know how to contact the correct agency. Just like the folks at Medicaid wouldn't be able to talk to what it takes to graduate from high school, we as educators can't talk fully and deeply about what those different waivers mean. We have a high level knowledge to point people in the right direction, but you really need to go directly to the agency providing those things in order to get really good, deep information. Yes, the slides from today will be put up when they post the recording as well. So yes, you will have links to all of those things.
And those going directly to the source in each of those documents, those links are there. So it will tell you exactly who to contact. And I know some of the systems are confusing, but we have walked through and we have worked with folks from those agencies to make sure that everything is accurate. And if you ever find something that is not, please let us know because things change and we will get it updated. The last thing, NTAC-C is the National Technical Assistance Center for Transition, the collaborative. So it really is a cross-agency group of folks nationally that provide information about transition. If you would like to go to that, there's a ton of good information. I'm not going to share that today because we're running out of time, but I do want to share the newly released Transition Iowa website, which is also chock full of information and information in different categories. So transition planning, there's some learnabouts and some beginning kinds of things. There are, I'm looking for the resources. There's a great timeline that I'm trying to find, and Mari, if you're on, if you can tell me where that is, I would go right to that. But anyway, there's a ton of information, resource guides, vignettes, info sheets, modules. The modules are really, one of them is about high expectations. So I'm just going to point that one out again. So really ways to help families understand the transition planning process. So tons of great information here as well.
The child's birthday in 21, how critical is that those kind of align?
It is. It's if the student's birthday is August 28th and school starts August 29th, they would be done. If they turn 21 before school starts, if school starts August 29th and their birthday is August 30th, they would get to go through that entire next year because they were not 21 when the school year started.
So it's all about when school year starts.
Yes. And keep in mind that although IDEA allows for a student to attend up through their 21st birthday, that's not always the best situation for all kids. It's allowable by law, but if they have met their graduation requirements and they've met their transition needs, most kids are not going to want to stay in school until they're 21. So it's a conversation to be having continuously throughout those high school years. But yeah, it depends on the start of your school district's start date and when the student's birthday is.
Okay, got it.
Well, I wanted to just share this real quick, the transition planning roadmap that is on the Transition Iowa website. You may have seen lots of these and they're all a little bit different, but the thing that I absolutely love about this is that it begins in elementary school. And you look at in elementary school, we're looking at safety, understanding my disability, involvement in the community, and self-advocacy skills. Those things begin very, very early. And I can't stress that enough because I worked in high schools for a long time. And I can't tell you the number of kids that said, I don't have a disability, because we tend to shield them from that like it's a bad thing. And it's not a bad thing. It's a part of who they are. And how can we help them understand it and work with it rather than necessarily try to work around it and not have them be a part of the conversation. So I just absolutely love how this starts very early and talks you through all of the key pieces.
Yeah, and I think I like that a lot too. And I like the way that it breaks it down. But to kind of back off what Kirsten said is not only is their disability part of who they are, but mainly what they need to be able to tell someone, whether it's when they go to college, when they go to work, whatever is, these are the things that are difficult for me. This is how you can help me be successful. So in a school environment, that might be, I need to go to a quiet room to take a test because I'm just entirely too distracted by lots of people getting up, moving around or whatever while I'm trying to focus on a test. In a work environment, that same thing, that distractibility might be, please don't set me by the elevator where people are going to be getting on and off all day because I'm going to be very distracted by that. It would be much better for me. I would be much better employee if I could sit in a more quiet part of my work environment. So yes, that might be part of their disability, but mainly what they, students, young adults, even adults need to be able to articulate is what things are difficult for me, how can I be more successful, and how can you help make that happen, be it in college or in school or in a work environment.
I do want to respond. There was a question about, will these services start, my child's 17, before school's over? And while we can't speak directly to that because we don't know what services your child may need and ask offered to, help you with kind of figuring some of that out, I want to stress that there are many, many services that we talked about today that do start before a student exits high school. And so that's why in Iowa, we start at 14, because we know that it's important to begin having these conversations and begin connecting with these services early on. So if your child has an IEP, be having these conversations at that meeting. And remember, you can always call an IEP meeting anytime you have a question that you can ask a question without calling an IEP meeting, but if you think there are services that need to be reconsidered or reworked, you can call that IEP meeting anytime that you want or that you need to. Also, there was a question about requesting pre-ETS services, and I think we kind of answered that, but I want to make sure that's clear. Pre-ETS services, you must have a pre-ETS agreement in place. So between that talks about the pre-ETS areas that the student would receive services in, and the parent has to sign that for a student who's under the age of 18. So it is requested. It certainly can come from a VR counselor, from a school district, but it also could come from a parent, the request for that.
Great. Other questions in there that we've got about 5 minutes that we could touch on.
There was one about what RIOT stood for, and that stands for review, interview, observe, and test. And if you look at the into the Iowa transition model, it's written there as RIOT, but also with those 4 words. So I know, sometimes we do this so often that we talk very quickly through some of these things and we forget it's not second nature to anybody. So also the one other thing I did want to point out, the very last slide in the slide deck, you will see once it gets posted, Kirsten's and my contact information is on that very last slide. So both of our email addresses as well as our phone numbers are listed there. But as Kirsten said, also your best bet, if you have a specific, thanks for that. If you have a specific question about your student, your son, your daughter, your very best bet is going to be to connect with the school, because they're going to have the very specific need or understanding of what is required at that school in order to graduate, in order to move on, what unique things they might have decided at that local level. Kirsten and I and anybody to ask can probably provide you high level things, but your best bet for really specific things regarding your student are either going to come from your district or by connecting with someone from the AEA who may have been at your son or daughter's IEP meeting.
And to piggyback on that a little bit, I did, as reviewing through those questions very early on, there was one about how do I find out about my district's adaptations for 4333? And it's exactly what Kim just said. Your district will know. We don't keep track at the Department of Education of what every district is offering or providing. Those things might change, but finding out from your district as to how they're approaching 4333 and graduation for students who have IEPs.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us. See you next week as we continue our transition webinars and unpacking the mystery of transition. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.